How can you lead a life fully in flow? This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And after I read The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer, I realized that there's several parameters that can help you and can help us to lead a life that is more in flow. This is directly connected to the topic of Wu Wei, the Taoist, the belief that life flowed like a stream and we were meant to follow it. What can be very hard to conceive is that we can think that this means just accepting passively everything that comes our way. And this is not at all what they mean by it. Sometimes the Wu Wei approach, or life in flow or surrendering, actually is something that requires effort, but not exactly. It can still demand work, but it's not going against the natural flow. For instance, in his book, The Surrender Experiment, Michael Singer explains that there were many opportunities that came his way that maybe weren't necessarily things that he actually wanted to do on the moment, but felt drawn to it, felt that this was the right action to take, so to speak. And this is what Wu Wei often feels like. It's not necessarily what we want, but it's what life guides us towards. And I know it can be quite hard to comprehend, but it really is just a feeling. And once you tap into this feeling, you realize that there is a certain flow to life, and you start to feel when you're going against it. For instance, when you're persevering with something, but your energy is off and you have an intuition that this is maybe not the right direction to go in, but you ignore that intuition, you continue to push, and maybe that project doesn't bring you much joy, maybe it doesn't work out, maybe something gets in the way. And I've noticed this time and time again, especially if you have your own business, you'll see that there are times where you just persevere because it's a goal you set yourself, and therefore you think you should do it, and you've told people about it maybe, but something inside of you is a bit off. Something inside of you thinks maybe this isn't the right direction. What can be really tricky in those moments is to see the difference between that and just plain fear. Because of course, sometimes when certain actions are a bit scary or nerve-wracking, it can also put us off. And that's different. So there's not doing something because it's not really aligned and it's not really in the flow of things, and that's going against Wu Wei. That's one thing. And then there's not doing something because of fear, and that's something else. And this is where I often find it quite confusing and quite tricky to navigate. In order to see this, ask yourself, are you enjoying the process? Is there something inside of you, in spite of fear, in spite of maybe being out of your comfort zone, that thinks, okay, this is aligned, this feels right, this is helping me to learn something and grow in my journey? If that's the case, then probably this is a Wu Wei approach. Another way to look at things is that as you're living your day-to-day life, as you're working and progressing on your business goals, for instance, start to sense if you have a natural intuition towards certain things, and start to pay attention if synchronicities happen, if you meet certain people at certain places, people recommend something at different moments. And the more you tune into these things, the more you pick up on this intuition, the more you'll see coincidences again happening, all these synchronicities, but also you'll start to really feel this Wu Wei. What I've noticed is that if you actively, proactively let go of your expectations, let go of clinging, desperately wanting something. Pema Chodron talks a lot about this in her books, this notion of clinging, and the Shenpa, which is this Buddhist concept, which is linked to either clinging to a desire or clinging to avoid a pain. And both of these are called Shenpa, and this energy, this clinging, often holds us back because if we are desperate to achieve a goal, we probably won't achieve it. And in the same way, if we're desperate to avoid the pain of anything, being heartbroken, then probably it's going to be hard to enter a relationship because we're going to have this fear holding us back and this clinging to the avoidance of pain. Okay, so this was the Shenpa aspect of things. And this can be very useful because the more you're able to let go of this Shenpa, let go of this clinging energy, and the more you can surrender to the Wu Wei, the more you will feel it. The way it often shows up for me is that I will get an intuition or an inkling that something will happen or not happen. And I either choose to follow it, just tap into it, accept it, follow it, or I choose to ignore it. I'll get a feeling that something will get cancelled or something will change. And then I think, no, you're just worried it'll happen. Don't cling on to this idea. This isn't true. And I will ignore this feeling. And 90% of the time, it turns out to be true. For instance, I'm recording this episode when a guest didn't show up. I got a feeling they wouldn't. There was a bit of a mismatch regarding times and US times. And I had this feeling, but I thought, no, you're just worried, you're just concerned. And I ignored it. And sure enough, person didn't show up, which is why I'm doing the solo shows instead, because I might as well with all my equipment all set up. So the idea here is that we often actually know. If we really tune in, if we really tap into this inner knowledge, this inner source, everything is interconnected. And the more you feel it, the more you sense it, the more you will have all these insights. It's a bit spooky sometimes. So some coincidences are a bit strange at times, and you get used to it. And this is also directly linked to the law of attraction. So I know I am putting lots of concepts together here. There's the aspect of Wu Wei, there's the Shenpa with the clinging, the Pema Chodron talks about, and there's also the law of attraction. Now, why are these all related? Like I said, the clinging and Shenpa is something we need to let go of and surrender so we can be more within the flow of things, which is the Wu Wei. And then the law of attraction comes from being in that flow. Because what happens is you will project certain ideas, certain actions, certain thoughts into the flow of life, and you will receive and perceive it, and therefore you will be able to bring it into your reality. Now, I know this can sound a bit metaphysical. You can look at it from a neuroscience perspective and see that the brain is then programmed to actually see and sense things that you're focusing on, which is why you attract them in your life. If you're a more down-to-earth person, maybe you prefer the more concrete approach to this. Either way, it works. And the Wu Wei aspect, I really, really love this because it feels to me like we are both very powerful and very powerless at the same time. And this is sort of dichotomy of being proactive, applying all of that, Stephen Covey 7 habits, first habit, being proactive, taking action and living and leading and designing your life. Yes, amazing. I love it. And on the other hand, there's this surrendering to life, to what unfolds, to what is meant to be, to what's not in our control. And it's constantly balancing both these aspects because we don't want to totally give up our power and be dominated by the world of what's happening and just letting ourselves go with it all. But we don't want to, on the other hand, either resist the flow of life. If things aren't meant to be, if things aren't meant to happen, if there's a conflict or misalignment between certain goals and projects and what's going on, then it simply won't happen. And the more you resist that, the more you force it, the worse it'll get. This gets even more complicated in a similar way, thinking about the notion of self-discipline. So quite similar to this idea of being proactive, there's this idea of self-discipline, and I'm a huge fan of self-discipline. Absolutely love it. Absolutely love Giovanni Dienstmann's work, Mindful Self-Discipline. I'm also a mindful self-discipline facilitator. So love self-discipline. But here's again the thing, again, this balance. Sure, be proactive, have self-discipline, by all means cultivate it, but yet don't go against the flow of life. Oof, tricky. As you work on this, you'll realize that being in the flow of life actually increases your self-discipline, because just as Michael Singer explains in his book, The Surrender Experiment, the actions that maybe come your way still require self-discipline. It's not like just Wu Wei, everything flows and you can just relax and sit on your sofa. It's more like projects will come your way and things seem to be happening to indicate that's the direction to go in. But to actually execute those projects and to actually make progress on them, you need to take action and work towards it and have the self-discipline to make it happen. So it still requires work, but it's not going against the natural flow of things. I feel you're far more likely to understand this episode if it's something you've lived and felt. Because if you feel this natural flow, how things are going, how things are unfolding, then you know, are you in the flow or are you going against it? And I was very close to going against it, for instance, when recording this episode, because I felt the flow of things was that the podcast episode wasn't going to happen. And I just ignored it. I just went against that feeling because I didn't want that to be the case. So I just ignored it. When instead of, for instance, preparing for the interview, had I followed my intuition, I could have started recording solo shows early on today, for example. So I guess this summarizes a bit the idea. So to generalize and to summarize what we've discussed so far, there's this idea of flow and Wu Wei, which is the natural unfolding of life. And if we think about nature, things just happen. If we think about most things in life, they're sort of miracles, us being here, for instance. And so that's just a natural unfolding. Then there's this idea of Shenpa and clinging, which Pema Chodron talks a lot about, and in Buddhist texts in general, which is this idea of clinging too much to goals or to avoid pain. And if we surrender and let go to that, we're more easily within the flow of life. And the last concept I discussed was this idea of being proactive and that mindful self-discipline, which is something we can use for the actions that are in flow. For example, right now, again, me doing this episode is still requires some effort, still requires some self-discipline, but felt in the flow of what I was going to be doing. I kept thinking, oh, if the guest doesn't show up, I'll record the solo shows. And of course, it was just there all along. I hope this makes sense. I know it's a complicated concept. I will record more on this topic because I'm really passionate about it. I highly, highly recommend reading The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer. I'll put the link in the show notes. This will probably give you an even deeper understanding of this. There's also many recordings by Alan Watts on Wu Wei, which are fascinating. Obviously, 7 Habits by Stephen Covey, and obviously Mindful Self-Discipline by Giovanni Dienstmann. And pretty much any book by Pema Chodron on Buddhism and Shenpa and all these topics are fantastic. If you have to remember one thing from today that I maybe haven't highlighted enough, is let go. Let go of that angst, let go of that clinging, let go of your expectations, let go of forcing things to go just the way you want them to go. Breathe, breathe, let go, relax. And the more you're able to do this and actively, proactively encourage surrender, 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 the better things will turn out and the more you'll be in flow. And again, that doesn't mean being passive. Let's not misunderstand surrendering with passivity. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching if you're on YouTube. Thank you for listening if you're on the podcast. Wishing you an amazing day, and please tell me in the comments, maybe write a review. Let me know any questions you have, anything you're curious to know more about. Happy to share and discuss it more, so put it in the comments. Thank you.